Chapter 4 Dimensions. When I was a teenager, I fell asleep with a CD playing on repeat. I drifted off to sleep listening to the music. I faded into the dream world. Then I awoke to someone laughing in my room. I sat up, and to my horror, there was a girl standing in the shadows of the corner of the bedroom. I recoiled, pushing myself up against the headboard of the bed. But as I breathed and my eyes adjusted, I realized that the laughing had been coming from one of the songs on the CD, and that the girl in the corner had been my mind, making sense of the pattern of shadows combined with the laughing. My heart rate slowed. I was very glad. I reminded myself that thankfully, ghosts are not real. There is something very reassuring about living in the 3 dimensions we can see, 4 if you count time. Whether we are talking about ghosts or religious beings, like angels and demons, there is something disorienting about discussions of the spiritual world. Debates about metaphysics often seem too otherworldly and too speculative to be of value. When we talk of demons, angels, and gods, we tend to think of things that are outside of the natural world. And while we might theoretically believe in them, depending on our religious tradition, we feel quite separate from them and do not really have a definition for what spiritual means. This may be why many, while perhaps not officially labeling themselves atheists, prefer to view such discussions as relevant only to what happens when we die, if at all. But in Chapter 3, we saw that when atheists take psychedelics, they often cease to be atheists. We saw that they reported experiences that convinced them that there is more to this universe than the 3 dimensions we see. These people who are not spiritual, and who in fact reject the existence of the spiritual, take psychedelics and then get a glimpse of a world that convinces them there is more than what their material assumptions have led them to believe. Sometimes these former atheists join traditional religions, but often they simply adopt an informal spirituality. The experiential evidence is enough for them to discard a previously held naturalistic view of the universe in favor of something that looks more religious to outsiders. So here we have a rare case where the 2 worlds collide. No longer is the spiritual world out there and the natural world here. Instead, you have people doing something very much in this world, taking a drug, and experiencing something in that spiritual world so profoundly that they change their whole way of viewing both worlds. This intersection is not something that would have surprised a medieval thinker. The great 12th century theologian Thomas Aquinas argued angels and demons do indeed interact with this world. He viewed these entities as bodiless and comprised of only an intellect and a will. Lacking a corporeal form, an angel could assume an appearance by projecting an image into our minds. This would bring us into the presence of a real entity, even if the encounter took place completely within our brains. Putting aside any theology of biblical angels or demons, one could ask, is it possible that DMT does something to our brain chemistry that enables us to come into contact with bodiless beings that can manipulate our minds? But for many, the language of the spiritual sounds more like fairy tales than real life. So perhaps there is another way to look at these observations in a way that might make more sense to a materialist. As we have seen, we cannot explain away these experiences by looking at brain chemistry. Brain chemistry can at best be described as a mechanism, but it doesn't explain the object of the experience, or whether the things seen are simply hallucinations or something real. Furthermore, many of the things seen and felt are very difficult to explain away with hallucination. And some of the people most likely to do so, atheists, don't once they have actually taken a psychedelic drug themselves. So let's consider what it might be that they are seeing, if not a hallucination. Many have speculated that perhaps hallucinogens allow us to see into a dimension that we would not have otherwise had access to. For example, Michael Pollan writes, "Quantum mechanics holds that matter may not be as innocent of mind as the materialists would have us believe. For example, a subatomic particle can exist simultaneously in multiple locations as pure possibility until it is measured, that is, perceived by a mind. Only then, and not a moment sooner, does it drop into reality as we know it, acquire fixed coordinates in time and space. The implication here is that matter might not exist as such in the absence of a perceiving subject. Needless to say, this raises some tricky questions for a materialist understanding of consciousness. The ground underfoot may be much less solid than we think. And he is right that quantum mechanics do muddy our understanding of reality. But his comments on coordinates bring the question of dimensions, and it is there that things get very interesting. For example, in The Grand Design, atheist Stephen Hawking speculates that there may be up to 10 dimensions based on quantum theory. And while Hawking describes the other dimensions as small, he does so with the analogy of looking at the end of a straw. That is, they only appear small thanks to our perspective, not based on their actual size. Other scientists, such as astrophysicist Paul Sutter, speculate that dark matter, a substance thought to account for more than 80% of the universe's mass, yet invisible to us, could potentially be explained by forces and matter being present in other dimensions. While this research is new and still highly speculative, it should at least provide an intellectual foundation for holding that these other dimensions contain attributes that are not yet known to us. The possibility that a fourth or more spatial dimension may contain entities is something that has long been speculated. Could this hidden dimension be the source of entities observed while in the ecstatic states, both drug and naturally induced, that we discussed in Chapter 3? Anthropologist W.Y. Evans Wentz notes in his Fairy Faith in Celtic Countries, it is mathematically possible to conceive fourth-dimensional beings, and if they exist, it would be impossible in a third-dimensional plane to see them as they really are. Hence, the ordinary apparition is non-real as a form, whereas the beings, which wholly sane and reliable seers claim to see when exercising seership in the highest kind, may be as real to themselves and to the seers as human beings are to us here in the third-dimensional world when we exercise normal vision. Researcher David Luke argues that geometry often seen while consuming DMT might also point to another dimension. He writes, Evans Wentz's perception has some resonance with my own observations about the frequently extra-dimensional nature of DMT geometry. Andrew Gallimore's perverse metatechnological ontology of the simulated universe theory similarly demands that any artificially intelligent simulated universe, such as our own, must be created by higher-order technologists existing in a world with more dimensions than this one. Similarly, in his book Supernatural, Graham Hancock speculates that there might be entities within these other dimensions. We might feel very sure that there is no more reality than the material world in which we live, but we cannot prove that this is the case. Theoretically, there could be other realms, other dimensions, as all religious traditions and quantum physics alike maintain. Theoretically, the brain could be as much a receiver as a generator of consciousness, and thus might be fine-tuned in altered states to pick up wavelengths that are normally not accessible to us. Of course, Evans Wentz, Luke, and Hancock are not coming to these conclusions as theoretical physicists might. They're coming at it as laymen, reflecting on research and their experiential backgrounds. But it is interesting to consider that there might be room for overlap in ideas between the ancient religions and modern science. Perhaps the ancients discovered something that modern science is just starting to scratch. Later, in Supernatural, Hancock speculates exactly this. It may be that DMT makes us able to perceive what the physicists call dark matter, that at present remains invisible to our senses and instruments. When I read Hancock's speculation on this point, I was immediately struck by the idea because my training in Christian theology also spoke of other dimensions. When most people think of Christianity's heaven, they think of a place and time. Heaven is a place you go to when you die, but few have formed hard opinions on what it actually is. Some imagine a cloud somewhere. Some imagine a state of mind. But Oxford New Testament scholar N.T. Wright argues that the biblical understanding of heaven must also be described in terms of dimension. In Surprised by Hope, Wright writes, "Heaven in the Bible is not a future destiny, but the other hidden dimension of our ordinary life. God's dimension, if you like." And so we have an interesting overlap between traditional Christianity, ancient paganism, cutting-edge astrophysics, and the experiences that take place when someone is on psychedelics. If confirmation of an idea grows as more sources of knowledge confirm it, it seems that the idea that other dimensions exist and that some interaction with them takes place in this world is an idea that is gathering a firm foundation. What if there is some sort of spiritual or heavenly dimension that overlaps and coexists with our own? What if something in our brain prevents us from seeing into it? Like clearing blocked ears, allows us to see what we normally do not. In DMT, the spirit molecule, Strassman argues that DMT can be naturally released by the pineal gland, and that this is part of the basis of a soul's movement in and out of the body. DMT released by the pineal gland as part of what leads to things like heightened states of consciousness. These effects are seen naturally during meditation, sex, prayer, near-death experiences, etc. Strassman states, DMT could trigger a period of remarkable progress in the scientific exploration of the most mystical regions of the human mind and soul. As we speculated, what if psychedelics gives us vision to see what we are usually blind to, vision into another dimension? This has been described as the ecstatic vision by mystics, and N.T. Wright would describe it as the heavenly dimension. But whatever we call it, what if it is real, and there are real entities there? What if the beings within that dimension can see into our dimensions, but we cannot see into theirs? Consider Hawking's straw analogy. Imagine a thin diameter straw. If you are positioned at the end of the straw, it appears almost invisible, a small dot. But if you are positioned at the side of the straw, the whole object becomes visible. Imagine our own dimension being situated such that we cannot see into the heavenly dimension, but that the beings in that dimension are able to step into ours and then back into their own. If true, this would be shocking. It would force us to wonder if the myths of old were really fiction. What if the apparitions of gods, spirits, demons, and angels were not always or necessarily based on pure human imagination? What if some of them represent true interactions between humans who live in the fourth visible dimensions, height, width, depth, and time, with entities that live in some other dimension, the heavenly one? What if the stories of old are, in part, accounts of people being able to see into the other dimensions via drugs, meditation, prayer, music, etc.? An answer in the affirmative would provide much explanatory power in human history. It would explain why so many people in so many places have experienced such similar things. It would explain why people seem to gain genuine insight about things they should not otherwise know. It would explain why almost all human civilizations have been so religious. It would explain why we all seem to have this built-in idea of a soul. It might explain why consciousness exists. It might give insight into why we all love music so much. As physicists speculate on the other dimensions to explain dark matter and the workings of the universe, we can also explain quite a bit about the human experience using other dimensions. So perhaps this is where atheism and religion cease to be separate things. Perhaps all this time we have simply been using different terms. Perhaps atheists use words like aliens and interdimensional beings, dark matter, and alternative dimensions, while the religious use words like gods, angels, demons, spirits, and heaven. Atheists might find it helpful to view these new discoveries as similar to when we found new species in new frontiers. Something like when we first went into the depths of the ocean floor and discovered otherworldly-looking sea creatures that resembled monsters from myths. Perhaps atheists need to put the mystical visions in this category. What if the visions represent a discovery of some new frontier that has heretofore been invisible to us? But for the religious, the ability to see into this heavenly dimension is not as new. So let us now look at some of the ways that religions have historically viewed spiritual entities, and consider how that might impact and interact with what we have learned so far.